But we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, and the title of today's sermon is Faith in Politics, which is super fun and always timely. There's a couple of things that I think would be good for us to kind of be pondering as we get into this. First of all, in the text itself, there are numerous places in the book of Ecclesiastes where I think, if I'm right, that Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon, and I think I am right on that. There are places where you see Solomon in the background. You can imagine that he's thinking of his dad. Right? Who is Solomon's dad? David. And David was king, right, in Jerusalem. But part of David's story, as you reflect on that, is that there was a king in Israel before David, right? Saul. And Saul was a total dud. He was a wicked man. He did not obey God. He would not listen to anyone but himself. He was a bad man. And he, as God anointed David to be king in his place, Saul got jealous about that. And so he turned against David and he began trying to assassinate David. And do you know what David's response was? He fled, right? He got out of the way of that. But then David had numerous opportunities over the course of his life to kill Saul. And he didn't. Have you ever thought about that? Because as we think about, this is kind of where we're going today, the idea that like government's better than anarchy, right? Maybe. So it's a question today for a lot of people. But it's corrupt often. Always. To some degree or another, government's corrupt. And we would be tempted to think, well, if there's a corrupt government, then I'm justified in rebelling against it. And Solomon's going to challenge that viewpoint, and I think he's challenging it because he's thinking of his father, who David, when he had an opportunity to kill Saul, who was trying to assassinate him, do you know what David said? David said, I'm not going to lay a hand on what? On the Lord's anointed. And you're thinking, Saul is the Lord's anointed? What? He's a wicked, corrupt man. He's a bad king. But David still saw there that God is doing something with Saul that it's not my place to try to override that. This is very uncomfortable for us. But I think Solomon's thinking of this as he begins to tell us about how we should think about government and the state and the ruling authority. So that's one thing to have in the background. The second is this, and I didn't comment on this last week because I don't like giving hot takes on things, meaning I don't like speaking quickly about stuff. I like to think about things a little bit more. But on July 13th, one of the most shocking, but also sadly not surprising things in my lifetime politically was that somebody attempted to assassinate the Republican nominee for the presidential campaign, for Donald Trump. Someone tried to kill him. And there's lots of things that people have said about that are very appropriate. There's calls for unity in our culture. There's calls to calm down the rhetoric. And that's all good, and I pretty much agree with all of that. What I'm thinking about this is my concern, this question, is political violence becoming more normal in our society? Because I think for a long time our society has been governed by, if we've got a problem with the political sphere, what precisely do we do about it? Well, for a long time the idea has been we vote. I'm talking like contemporary, right? We vote, that's what you do. Now over my lifetime what's begun to happen is people, they don't just go vote, they riot, right? They turn to violence, either on kind of a mob level or on an individual level. And my problem with this is, I mean, even today, there are way too many people who are saying about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump's life, they're comfortable saying out loud in public that their only wish is that the shooter would have been more accurate. That is a shocking sentiment, whether you like Donald Trump or not. Because the idea Are we as a society going to be comfortable with the idea that individuals can take upon themselves the right and burden of deciding things for everyone? Like, that's what is happening in that moment. There is an individual that's deciding, I'm not going to let the voting public of the United States of America sort this issue out and then choose to live with it, whether it was my preference or not. That's not what he's going to do. Instead, it's I'm going to take upon myself the role of deciding for everyone. Okay, now my issue with that, and many people entertain that. I know folks that are on the right-wing side of things have entertained this thought about President Biden. Like, maybe somebody should take him out. Like, just shocking sentiments. My problem with that is that is definitionally anarchy. Okay, the definition of anarchy is no government, everyone just does whatever they think is right. And there are many people naively and foolishly who at some level believe that we would be better off if there were no government, if there were no state power, and we were all just left to do whatever we want. The problem is the Bible speaks to this and tells us what happens when this is what we do. We find this in the book of Judges. At the tail end of the book of Judges, I just challenge you, go read Judges 19, 20, 21. I'm not going to get into it today. It's ugly. But 4 times over the last chapters of Judges, we see this statement, or one very much like it. Judges 21, this is the last line of the book of Judges. Judges 21, verse 25, it says this, in those days there was no king in Israel. That is, there's no state, there's no government. Everyone did what was right in his own eye. That's the closing line of the book of Judges. It's ominous. It's ominous. It's nasty. And when you look and when you read the last chapters of the book of Judges, what you don't find is everybody's left to their own devices. They all do what they think is right, and they live in harmony and peace and joy together. That's not what you find. What you find is rape, murder, civil war, thousands slain. That's what you find. The people who think that we would be better off with no overarching governing authority are extraordinarily foolish and naive. These folks, I believe, they are profoundly ignorant of human nature. And it's not that if there were no state, that every single person would be as bad as they possibly could be. It's not that. It's not that it would instantly turn into like Mad Max apocalypse. But it's that without any governing law, then every bad actor in society is going to be as bad as they can get away with. Yes? Now, what's going to be the limitation on what they can get away with? Individuals who do something about their evil. The problem is you'll find individuals will all have different ideas about what to do about a bad actor in society. So all of a sudden what you'll have with that is chaos, because you'll have a whole bunch of people who they're just going to do whatever they want to do right up until the point where someone stops them. And all the people that even desire to be good actors in society are going to have differing ideas on how we should sort this out. Some of them are going to go full vigilante Batman mode and just start taking people out. Some people are going to advocate for a more measured approach. Some people are going to be advocating maybe we should set up some kind of, police force. Wait, state? Is that what you're saying? State? Government? And it'd be chaos and anarchy. So there's 2 main things I want to have in place as we start Ecclesiastes. Okay? Number 1, I hope that this is just patently apparent to people. That government is better than anarchy. Is that fair? But then the second problem is that government is super frustrating. Yes? And so we can't live without it, but it's very hard to live with it. Because there's lots of problems and lots of things that go wrong and lots of things that are vexing to people. And then the last thing, maybe as we just get started, is I just want to debunk something. And that something is, I've said this many times before now, but it's worth repeating. Christians are supposed to engage with the political sphere of society. Okay? We have lived in a culture for a long time that's got all kinds of wonky ideas about things like separation of church and state, and we don't have to get way far into that. But the basic assumption that many people make is that you're not supposed to bring your Christian faith to bear on how you think about society. The problem with that is that it's a faulty premise, because it's the idea that if you have a religious perspective or an ideological perspective, you're supposed to leave that at the door when we talk about political stuff. But the issue is that nobody comes to the table without some ideological view. Nobody comes to the table without some kind of essentially religious view. Nobody comes to the table with just a clinical, detached view of facts without bringing any ideas of what should be to the table. So I just wish that the misconception would die forever, that people are supposed to leave their ideology at the door, specifically Christians, when they come into the political sphere. That's absolute nonsense and gibberish. So when you go and vote this year, and vote you should, you absolutely should do so with the full weight of your convictions in Christ brought to bear on how you do that. Yes? And it's not just the voting, it's also being involved and participating in the life of your community and in what is going on and taking an interest in what goes on. And it's okay for you to do that. It is good and right for you to do that. And it's good and right for you to think as a Christian would think about those issues. It is a misconception in the extreme. If I could say it like this, do you believe that King Jesus has nothing to say to our city government? I don't believe that. And so it is okay for us to speak, to think, to engage, to participate in our society as Jesus people. So that in mind, Christian faith has a lot to do with politics. We can't get very far today, to be honest with you, because it's one sermon and you could say a lot about the Christian view on politics. And I hope this generates maybe some really good discussion and reflection and meditation in your own heart, in your mind, in your small groups, in your families, all of it. But I want to give an overarching basic view out of Ecclesiastes chapter 8 on how people who have faith in God should think about government. And that's how we're going to go. Yes? Okay? So the first thing out of the gate, Solomon says, is basically you got to be subject to the government. This is pretty uncontroversial, but it's frustrating. It's uncontroversial because the only other option is anarchy. And we've said that's no good. That's going to be judges' territory. But you have to be subject to the government. He says, I say, keep the king's command. You pretty much have to do what he says. Now, this is the ancient Near East. So different governmental structure than we have. They have a monarchy, and we have a representative democracy, right? A republic. So it's a little bit of a different system, but the basic idea is there. You have to do what the state says. That's the basic idea. Keep the king's command. Do not be hasty to go from his presence, says Solomon. And the idea of going from his presence, that's a bit of a euphemism for really just denouncing him. It's the idea that when you're sitting across the table from somebody, there's some commitment that you have to maintain dialogue and maintain connection and even maintain loyalty and allegiance. You're at the table, right? To get up and go out of his presence, that's basically like saying, I'm done talking, I'm done connecting with you, I'm out. And it's in the Hebrew language, it's a euphemism then for denouncing somebody, withholding loyalty and allegiance. And Solomon says, don't be hasty. Don't be rash. Don't be hasty to go from his presence. You cannot easily and simply throw the state away. Christians are not people who are quick to casually renounce governmental authority. Now, Solomon gives a couple of reasons for this. The first is a practical reason. The practical reason is the king's power, right? In Ecclesiastes 8, verse 3, he says, do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. Okay? The king has some serious power, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of that for nothing. Yes? There's a very practical idea there. The word of the king is supreme, he says, verse 4. And who may say to him, what are you doing? So the state, the king in Solomon's day, Saul, in David's day, has power that is very difficult to contest. And there's a practical aspect of this. One of the things that you'll notice is that when you read the New Testament, the church, for several centuries, lived under the thumb of an incredibly powerful and at times very oppressive government, under the government of Rome. And at no point in the New Testament do you see any of the early church writers, the writers of the scripture, advocating for Christians to forcibly overthrow the government. You don't see that. And there's lots of opinions that people have on why it is that you don't see that. But one of those reasons would be eminently practical. And the idea would be this: a little band of Christians trying to contest the power of Rome and the legion on martial grounds, military ground, is doomed to failure. And all that's going to do is get Christians killed. And so there's a very practical, there's other reasons why the idea would be that Christians should not try to militarily overthrow Rome, but at least that one is there. Do you see that? The Bible does not actually advocate for foolishness. There is a certain pragmatism in saying, how much can I really accomplish there, and how much juice will I get from that squeeze? Does that make sense? Have you ever heard that saying, the juice is not worth the squeeze? What does that mean? It means there's not enough there to be worth the pain and the actual death even that would come from that. But then what maybe to us the more controversial reason that Solomon gives for keeping the command of the king is he says, because of God's oath to him. I say to you, obey the command, keep the command of the king because of God's oath to him. And this is a biblical teaching that we sometimes struggle with. And the teaching is that world leaders, governmental leaders, are in their positions exactly because God in his sovereignty has put them there. So this is what the New Testament has to say as well. Very similar passage to Ecclesiastes chapter 8 is Romans chapter 13, the opening verses of it. Paul says this to the Roman church: let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority. There is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. He does not allow you to say, I can see how some governments are put in place by God. The ones that are good and just and right, that do things basically correctly, those ones are put in place by God. No, says Paul, all of them. All of them. Every authority. Every authority. Those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. And again, Solomon's father David took this idea very seriously when he's being pursued by Saul to be killed. And David, at multiple times in his life, finds himself in a position several times where he sneaks up on Saul. And he could just shiv him in the back right there and be done with it. And he doesn't. And I think Solomon's reflection on his father's ethic is part of what we find in Ecclesiastes 8. Submit to the king because God put him there. And God is doing something. God is not surprised by the fact that that person is in charge. God's not wondering like, oh, well, what are we going to do about this problem? God actually put him there. And you think, why did God put him in charge? Why did God put Saul in charge? That's not for David to ask. David doesn't know why God put Saul in charge. Saul, by that point in his life, going crazy. He's in serious mental, cognitive trouble. He's going insane. He's got paranoid delusions. He tries to spear David to the wall on multiple occasions. And David's there thinking, maybe, why would God put Saul in charge? We don't know. But God did put Saul in charge for that time, for reasons that we may not understand. And we can struggle with this, right? Have you ever asked this question? How do I reconcile the belief that God put these people in charge with the fact that they are wicked and corrupt? Have you ever wondered that? Let me give a category of thought here. For God to institute governmental authority is not the same thing as God approving of those people. Okay? Let me give you an example of this. In the book of Isaiah, multiple times, but for example, if you go read Isaiah chapter 10, what you will find is that God is speaking about the nation of Assyria. And God has raised up Assyria to be an instrument of his judgment against Israel. It's a fascinating thing to ponder and meditate on. Why? Because Israel is who? In the Old Testament, Israel, God's covenant people. Assyria, who's that? A nasty, wicked, corrupt people. Pagan idolaters who engage in all kinds of sinful, unjust, wicked behavior. But in that time, God raises up Assyria as an instrument of judgment against Israel. Now, does that mean that God is giving wholehearted approval of Assyria? No. All that it means is that in that time, in that place, Assyria is actually more aligned with the purposes of God than Israel is. And so God uses Assyria to do what he wants done. That is not God saying Assyria is therefore deserving of everyone's full and blind and absolute allegiance and loyalty. He's not saying that at all. But God can use wicked Assyria to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. In that moment, one of these nations is actually more aligned with God than the other, wicked though they are. Is that making sense? Now, what God says about Assyria, if you go read Isaiah chapter 10, is God says about Assyria that they are at the same time, they are a stick in his hand. They are an axe in his hand. They are a tool. And yet, they boast as though they are the ones in charge. And so then God, what he'll do is he will say about Assyria, is the axe going to boast against him who wields it? How absurd. So then what God promises is that judgment will come on Assyria. So it's not that Assyria are the good guys and Israel's the bad guys, per se. It's that in that moment, God wants to bring judgment over here, and he does it with these wicked, corrupt people over here. And the very simple point with that is that you will find over and over and over in the Bible that God can and does use imperfect, wicked, corrupt people to accomplish what he wants done. And you can have some tension with that. That's okay. But that's exactly what he does. God may be raising up a wicked leader or a wicked government to punish another more wicked government, only to face the judgment of God when they're done. And so when Paul says that every authority is instituted by God, the phrase instituted by God does not mean that the government authorities that God has instituted have his blank check of approval. It just means that God can and does use every single human leader for his purposes. By way of illustration, at the risk of making a wonky analogy, over the decades, the United States government, at different times, in different places in the world, has participated in deposing one evil governing body and replacing it with another. Yes? And then we could say, man, the person that we replaced was pretty bad. But the person that we replaced them with is also pretty bad. And we could say, well, why would we do that? Well, the reality is one dictator might be more aligned with the interests of the United States government than another dictator. And that doesn't mean that the United States government likes either one of them. Does that make sense? Now, my point is this. It's not to say that the United States government has done no wrong at any point in its history. That's absolutely patently false. But the simple point is that even on a human level, we can understand that we can choose to engage in things without giving wholehearted approval to those things. That on a human level, a human government can say, I don't like this, but this is more useful right now than this is. And if a human can do that, and the Bible clearly says that God can as well, then I think God can do that. And we have to be okay with that. God can and does install leaders to do what he wants done, even if those leaders are not righteous, just, or good. And you can find so many examples in the Bible of this exact thing. You can see it in Saul. You can see it to some degree in Solomon, who went kind of crazy in his life too and built the temple with slave labor. God can and does use wicked governments. Now, this is not absolute, but it's the biblical starting point. Okay, on a really practical level here, it means that the fact that you can point out some amount of corruption or personal wickedness on the part of governmental leaders does not actually give you the biblical justification to just throw off their authority. Do you get that? Not super hard to hear, but it's the biblical point. And you think, no, but this government's corrupt. Well, yes. So was Saul. So was Rome. So was Israel and Babylon and Assyria and every single human kingdom that's ever existed. Every human government has always been, to some degree or another, corrupt. And the mere fact that you can point that out doesn't mean biblically that you're justified in throwing it off. Yes? Now, what we also get in both Romans and Ecclesiastes 8 is actually an inherent job description of the state. So in Ecclesiastes 8, Solomon warns, do not take your stand in an evil cause. Why? Because the king does whatever he wants. He's got power. And what's the implication there? That part of the responsibility of the king is to punish people who take their stand in an evil cause. Part of the role of government biblically is to restrain evil, is to actually hand down consequences to people who do evil. This is exactly what Paul says in Romans 13, verse 3. He says, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Now, Paul's giving an ideal job description of the state, because we might read that and say, do you think sometimes rulers are a terror to good conduct? Yes. One of the things that we've been tricked into in the church today, we've been comfortable and safe and prosperous in America for so long that we think that persecution and oppression is foreign to the Christian life. And if you would take the lightest dive, the shallowest dive into church history, into the history of our people, you would find that the comfort that we live in, that's what's foreign to the Christian life. The vast majority of Christians who have lived over the last 2,000 years have experienced exactly persecution, oppression, terror to good conduct. So Paul's not ignorant of the fact that governments can be corrupt and governments can, in fact, punish people who are doing good. But he's giving an ideal job description. What is the state supposed to do? And to be honest, what does it often do? It often fulfills this role. Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Now, there are lots of crazy things happening in our culture today, and in some places, a frustration that many people have is that criminals are going unprosecuted. Yes? Now, you hear that a lot on the news, but the reality is, are the police not basically punishing bad people for doing bad things? They pretty much are. Now, you can find all kinds of examples because we live in a country with many, many, many municipalities, in a country of 350 million plus people. So sure, you can find examples of where this goes wrong. But ordinarily, what is most often happening is that evil's being kept in check. Yes? If somebody kills somebody else in our city, there is going to be an investigation launched to figure out who did that. And when they are caught, they are going to be given consequences. Do you feel basically confident that that's what would happen? I do. I feel basically confident. The idea here is that there's an inherent job description of the state that both the Old Testament and the New Testament give. And it's the idea that the state exists to impose order on chaos. And in doing that, to restrain the darkest, most vile, evil impulses of mankind. So even a flawed government is better than anarchy because to some degree it does do this. It binds in human evil. It punishes people who do evil. Now, this also gives us a beginning of understanding why the authority of human government is not absolute. And the reason is that the clear implication of both Solomon and Paul's job description of human government is that the government has a responsibility before God to act in some ways and not act in other ways. And then right away when we say that, what we can realize is that no government has actually ever perfectly lived up to that standard. So there's no government out there at all, period, that always does justice, always does what God says it should do, and never does what God says it shouldn't do. And then this gets us started on thinking, okay, so at what point do you realize or do you decide that enough is enough of that? Has anybody wondered that? Lots of people in our culture are wondering that. Lots of people today are casually throwing around things like, Second Civil War. I don't think we should be casual about that, but I know that's on people's minds. So Solomon, he's not ignorant of the fact that governments are flawed. And he gives us some things about the futility of human government. If you look in verse 10, a problem that we find is that human society, and therefore human government, does not always recognize or praise the right people. So you've got Paul in Romans 13, and he's giving an ideal. The government rewards the good and punishes the bad, right? And Solomon says, not always. Verse 10, he says, then I saw the wicked buried. The wicked. And they used to go in and out of the holy place, and they were praised in the city where they had done such things. Solomon has no need to be like politically correct or just nice all the time. He can say, like today we say you should never speak ill of the dead. Solomon's like, I could speak ill of some of the dead. Some of the dead. You know what the problem with some of them were? They were wicked and everyone thought they were great. And he says that's vanity. They used to go in and out. They went to church. They used to go in and out of the holy place, and they were praised by people, but they were wicked. And he says, verse 11, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of children of man is fully set to do evil. Solomon just sees this, and it's a vexing, frustrating reality that sometimes wicked people are praised. Sometimes wicked people have the adoration of the crowds. They have the love of the people, and they shouldn't. Sometimes that's the case. And sometimes the opposite's true as well. Sometimes righteous people, they get what the wicked deserve. So sometimes the reality is that society at large, and the government in particular, praises exactly who it shouldn't praise, and it punishes exactly who it shouldn't punish. Sometimes the righteous are regarded as the wicked, and the wicked are regarded as the righteous. And Solomon says it's the heart of mankind that's the problem. It's bent toward evil. And this problem is made worse because in this life, a person's evil deeds don't catch up to them for some time. The idea on a very practical level is that there's many people who are able to fool everybody. They're able to fool and deceive everybody so that they persist for a long time in their wickedness. And they never get a consequence for it. They never have to pay the piper. And so rulers on a governmental level, it is a possibility and a reality that rulers can do evil and get away with it. Have you ever seen that? A governing official that does evil. And you'd think in an ideal world that should be checked. The people should see that and they should disregard that person. The people should vote that person out of office. The people should give that person criminal prosecution. The people, right? But it never happens. At times, rulers do evil, and they are in charge and celebrated by the public, and they get away with it. And so what we find then is often it's the case that the people in charge and celebrated by the public are not the people who deserve to be. You see that? I've thought, I'm 36 years old, and so I've thought, I should run for president. I'm a year past the date I need to be, right? I should run for president. I think I could do a half-decent job based on, the standard that's been set. Sometimes you have people that are just evil or incompetent, and they're praised. Sometimes the people in charge are fools. We'll see this in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 16. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, when your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. Sometimes the people in charge are incompetent and things fall apart. They're greedy. That's what's meant by they feast at the wrong time. They feast all the time. That's all they do. And so they're greedy, and they drink to drunkenness. They're lazy, and they get nothing done. They're not working on the behalf of their people. They're not eating food in order to strengthen themselves for the task at hand. They're eating food to gluttonize themselves, to fill their belly, to drink to drunkenness. I would say that description probably aptly describes much of the governing class in our society today. Not a whole lot gets done. Things fall apart because of governmental incompetence. And at times it's worse than incompetence. It's just outright greed. It's people getting rich off of the position of public service rather than actually, serving the public service. Does this frustrate you? Frustrates me. And so Solomon says, government's better than anarchy, but it's always to some degree corrupt, broken, and frustrating. Okay, so far, Solomon's teaching is submit to the governing authority, even though it's often corrupt and broken. Yes? Now, is that the best we can do? Not quite. Solomon gives us an encouragement. Number one, that there are inherent limitations to all human authority. There are inherent limitations. If you look in Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 8, he says, no man has power to retain the spirit, that is, to imprison the spirit, or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from the war, is what the Hebrew text says there. There's a definite article there. The war, or that war, you might say. Nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. So he gives 4 inherent limitations of human authority. Number one, no one can imprison the spirit. Right? Those who are in earthly power cannot subjugate a person's will, no matter how hard they try. They can influence it, they can affect it, but no one can, there's no prison of the will. All of the best movies that we've ever seen, to some degree, say this, right? Gladiator, Braveheart, anyone? Braveheart, one of the greatest movies of all time. And the idea there is that a person can be placed physically in a box, but that doesn't mean that they are chained in their will, in their mind, in their heart. Yes? So Solomon gives an encouragement there. No matter how much the government oppresses its people, no matter how much you feel like your will is not imprisoned, no human can do that. That's also a challenge to you. Why? Because it means that you can never blame your responses and your actions to whatever on other people. You can never say to someone else, you made me feel a certain way, think a certain way, respond a certain way. You can't do that. That goes way beyond that principle, way beyond just government stuff. That goes all the way into friendships, churches, families, neighborhoods. Right? You can never look at your children and say, you made me. No, you can't do that. Why? Because no one can imprison the will, which the challenge there is that your will is yours. No one has chained you. No one has forced you to think anything. No one has forced you to feel anything. At all times, your will is free from the imprisonment of other people, up to and including the very government itself. And that carries an encouragement, but also a challenge with it. You're free. You have agency. You have decisions to make. How you will think, how you will respond, how you will even respond to your own feelings. And that carries a responsibility to actually make wise, righteous, good, godly decisions with those things. One of the things in our culture, unrelated to political things, is our culture now speaks in the language that lacks personal agency and accountability. So you can see this on people's even internal level. Kelsey and I were talking about this the other day. Sometimes we can fall, even in the church, we can fall into this language where we can start talking about, say, our brain chemistry, and we can differentiate between my body and me. Now, there's some wisdom sometimes in that, where if there's body chemistry stuff going wrong, hormonal issues, to try to address that in the right ways. However, at the same time, if you're getting angry, it's not your body doing something to you. Okay? Your body is you. You are an embodied soul. So whatever's happening, yes, something is happening around you or in you, but also you are choosing how to respond to that. Okay? When something, if I get hit in the head by a ball, this used to happen in youth ministry to me all the time. Kids would just find it funny to just throw a ball right into the side of my face. And man, few things would rile me up than getting hit in the head. How many of you, you hit your head and you're ready to just kill something? Anyone else like that? That's me. Now, so you hit your head and whatever's happening is happening. I don't know. Brain chemistry, bruise, blood flow, whatever. Something's happening and it's just, now I choose something there. I get to choose whether I just punch the nearest person to me or whether I breathe and calm down. Okay, this is so simple. No one can imprison the Spirit. You are not a slave of anything else than your own sin nature. And praise be to God through Christ, by the power of the Spirit, you are even free from that. You are free. No one can imprison your spirit, your will, if you are in Christ. So there's one check on governmental authority. Number 2, Solomon says there's no power over the day of death. So no human leader, despite the absolute most authority they could ever possess, that person does not dictate when or how he will die. This should inflict a measure of humility on all of us. I do not have control over the day of death. That is to say, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know that I'll get to the end of this sermon. I don't know that I'll get to the end of the day. I don't know that I'll wake up tomorrow. I don't know. No one controls the day of death. And then Solomon says, number 3, death surely comes to all. There is no release from the war, is what the Hebrew text says there in Ecclesiastes chapter, verse 8. There is no discharge from war. The article there, the war that Solomon has in mind is death. No one can escape this fate. So every governmental leader, they are going to face judgment. This is part of the reason why you don't have to inflict it. They are in the hand of God, every single one of them. And every single one, this is how one commentator writes it, I love this. He says, this is one realm where every man must advance, and every man must advance alone to single combat. And every man in succession must fall. There's no one who will ultimately escape judgment. And then Solomon says, wickedness will not deliver a person from death. Nothing humans do, good or ill, will rescue from this fate. The authority of the king and all the power brought to bear by wicked people and wicked governments is bested in the end by death. People will face judgment, every single one. Verse 12, Solomon says, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, this thing that frustrates him, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God because they fear before him. Solomon, he's looking out, and he, on the one hand, laments the injustice that he sees, because everywhere he looks, he sees wicked people that do wickedness, and they get away with it, and they profit from it, and they prolong their days by it. And why do we get frustrated by that? Because we want the wicked to get theirs. We want the good guys to win and the bad guys to lose. And we don't always see that happening in the timetable that we would prescribe. But Solomon, he says, that's frustrating. You look out and you see that. And at the same time, yet I know it will be well with those who fear God. And then he goes on to say, it will not be well with the wicked. So he has faith in God that all of the wrongs will be righted. Maybe not in Solomon's lifetime, but surely by God. So one of the practical applications to this, there are numerous. One is that human government, that is to say, like the Redmond City government and Deschutes County government and Oregon State government and the United States federal government, every single human government is actually accountable to God, whether they think so or not. A person may think that they are not subject to the laws of this country. If they commit a crime, they can go right on into the judge's courtroom and they can be tried and convicted and sentenced, and that can all happen while they're insisting that they are not subject to the laws of this land. Yes? Like whether or not you're accountable has nothing to do with whether you think you are. And so what Solomon says is every single person, and actually every human government, every single government is accountable to God, whether they think so or not. It's not at all out of line with Christian faith to tell Ed Fitch and our city council, now they don't think this, they don't operate like this is the case, I don't think, because of this weird view that you can't bring Christian stuff, you can't bring religious stuff into the government, and that's whatever. But the reality is, whether or not they think that they are accountable to God, whether or not they think that they will give an answer to God for every single thing that they do in governing other people, is irrelevant. They are accountable to God, and they will someday stand before. And God will have conversations about the mayor of a city and how they conducted their authority. And God will have conversations with people, with governors of a state about how they governed a state. And God will have conversations with presidents about how they govern a country. Every single person is accountable to God. And that actually becomes some of the reason why we are not quick to throw off government. Because then the response of faith to human government as a believer in Christ Jesus, the first thing, and this is not some trite, shallow, casual thing, it's the first thing, the deepest thing, the most important thing is to trust God. The reason that I don't have to overthrow every wicked government is not just the practical reason that I wouldn't be able to. I don't have that kind of power. It's also that they're not actually accountable most fundamentally to me. I'm not the judge. Now, I can tell them about what I think the judge has to say because he's given us the Bible, and we should do that. But I'm not actually the one who's supposed to carry out the judgment. God is doing something. He will bring every sinner into judgment sooner or later. God is always at work, day or night, and no one can fathom everything that God is doing. This is what Solomon says in verse 16. He said, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on the earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep. I saw all the work of God, but with the result that, what does he say? Man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. What's Solomon saying there? He's looking around the world and trying to fathom all of the trillions, like infinite little moments that happen here or there that affect things in the world. All that's done, all that's going to dictate how the future unfolds. And what Solomon does is no one can figure that out. No one knows what's really going on. We think that's a new thing today. I lament sometimes. I'm like, I don't even know what the truth is. I can't look at something online and believe that it's true. Does anybody else? I can't look at something that's video footage and believe that it's true. Like pretty much no matter what side it's on, like I never know. I'm like, I don't really know what's even real. Because now we have AI, and AI can just generate images and videos and sound. I have no idea what's going on. And Solomon says we cannot know all the business that is done on the earth. There's always more going on than we can understand. To the specific point, there's always more that God is doing, because we fall asleep at night, and then the world just keeps on going for however many hours of sleep you get per night. And then you wake up, and you don't realize, like, the world's just been going on all night long. Things just been happening. It's daytime on the other side of the planet. Business is happening. People are buying and selling stuff. Governments are making like things are happening while you are sleeping. And more to the point, God is doing things while you are sleeping. God never stops working. He never stops reigning over the cosmos. He never stops working in everything that he's doing and the purposes that he is working out. And so what that means for the Christian, means for the believer, is that, number one, we have to be content with the fact that we do not know or understand everything. And then, more importantly, we can be content with this because we are not people who look out and say, well, I guess it's all chaos and no one knows what's going to happen and it's just a wild card. No, that's not what it is. For believers in Christ, what we say is God has his hand on human history, and he's doing, for thousands of years, God has been getting done exactly what he wants to get done. Every step along the way. And so I don't have to try to figure it all out. I can't. But I know the one who knows everything, who reigns over everything. So the first thing that Christians do when we look at government and we're frustrated is we trust the sovereign God of the cosmos. And that cannot be overstated. Now, what else? We're subject to the governing authority. Christians, by and large, are not rebellious anarchists. Okay? So by and large, we pretty much submit to the government. Of course, everybody swings in, says all of the things that are good qualifiers of that. We don't submit to the government when the government tells us to do something that God says we can't do. We don't submit to the government when the government tells us we can't do something that we must do. Okay, and that's all well and good. I trust that we all basically understand that. If there's conflict between what the government tells you to do and what God tells you to do, you know which way to go. Yes, I trust that. Okay, now it's not always easy to know exactly what God's telling you to do, but the basic idea is there. Now, are there times to not be subject to the governing authorities? Yes, and Solomon speaks to this, the idea of knowing when not to submit. But he qualifies it first with several things. Number one, he says, chapter 8, verse 6, he says, there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. So what's he saying there? In the context there, the time and the way for everything is, there is a time and a manner in which a person may disregard the king, may work against the king. So again, I think he's reflecting on David. David's not going to assassinate Saul, but he's not also going along with Saul. And it ends up coming to actual conflict and disobedience on David's part. But Solomon says, first though, just know this, man's trouble lies heavy on him. Life is hard enough without taking a stand against the great power of the king. Solomon's not giving an excuse for cowardice here. But he's giving a counsel for wisdom. Again, is the juice worth the squeeze? It is a call to weigh how truly bad the government authority is against the worthwhileness of defying it in light of other very real problems that preoccupy human attention. So on a practical level, I think about, like, I'm a citizen of this country. And I think on that level, sometimes I think, man, like, what's going to happen over the course of my lifetime? Is there going to come a point where it's time to just say, no, like, we're not going to be subject to this government anymore? And I'm not saying that we're anywhere really near that right now. I'm just saying that question, and you're thinking on a political level. Now, attached to that, though, the political sphere is not the only sphere in which you live your life, right? Because what else are you besides a citizen of this country? Well, you're a citizen of heaven, for sure. And also, just even on an earthly level, you're a family member, right? Like, you're a husband, you're a father, you're a wife, you're a mother. You're a neighbor. You are a church member. Like, you've got all these other hats that you wear as well. Like, the trouble of life weighs heavily. How many of you, your life's very busy attending to many concerns? Some of you don't raise your hand. I'm like, what job do you have? So your life is full of real weighty concerns already, yes? So now, if you're going to think it's time to rebel against the United States government, let's just say for a second that we were actually, like, it's close to that kind of place. What are you measuring that against? Right? Like, it's this kind of question. Is the oppression of the government enough for me to neglect my wife and children to go organize a rebellion? Does that make sense? Like, every moment of your time is a zero-sum game. What that means is that every second that you spend right here is a second that you don't spend right here. Every hour that you spend right here is an hour that you don't spend right here. So every hour that you spend organizing a militia to fight against the United States government, that's an hour that you're not playing with your children. Does that make sense? That's an hour that you're not actually tending to your wife. That's an hour that you're not blessing and exhorting and edifying the members of your local church. Now, is there a time and place to actually say, like, but this is of such pressing importance that we have to do that? Hypothetically, sure. But that's what Solomon is saying. He's not giving you an excuse for cowardice. He's saying, like, is it actually really that bad? Is the authoritarianism so bad that it's worth leaving my children without a father? My church without a pastor? Right? It's not cowardice to recognize that your time and your life and your energy and your effort is a zero-sum game. So you have to weigh just how bad things are before you decide that the actual wisest, most righteous, and godly use of your time, life, energy, and effort is fighting against the government. On a very practical level, how much time do you spend on social media railing against the government? Okay, because every single moment that you're doing that, let me tell you what you're not doing. You're not spending time with the people around you, blessing and building them up and edifying them. And so I ask you, like, is that worth your time? It's not cowardice. We're not talking about being afraid and not acting because of fear. We're talking about wisdom. Is it worth your time to spend all your time blathering on social media while there's real flesh and blood human beings that need your attention and need your effort and need your love and need your wisdom? Life has enough to worry about without adding to it the great challenge of overthrowing government. So that's one qualification that Solomon gives. Maybe there's a right time and way to do this, but you got a lot of other troubles to worry about too. And the second limitation that he gives is that you don't have all the information. In verse 7, man does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be, right? So again, life is an enigma. It's a mystery. We don't really understand what's really going on. And so because the wicked ruler is going to get what's coming to him at the judgment of God, you don't have to be the judge right now. You don't know what God is doing with this leader, even if they are in many ways wicked and corrupt. So, just to go there today, is there a time to stand in defiance of governmental authority? And how would we know when it was that time? Solomon seems to entertain this thought. In verse 5, he says, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing. I think that's the idea. Whoever keeps the command of God is presumably what I think Solomon is saying there. He will know no evil thing. And the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. Remember Ecclesiastes chapter 3, the first verses there? There's a time for everything. Do you remember that passage? There's a time to keep silence, a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace, a time for building up, and a time for breaking down. What's required to know the time for everything? Wisdom. That's what's required. And so Solomon says the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. So that is to say, again, Christians are not a people who casually, rashly decide, let's just burn everything down and start from scratch. Now, what looms in my mind with this, have you ever wondered this question from a Christian believer perspective? Were the American revolutionaries like right or wrong to do what they did? Has anyone ever asked this question? It's an uncomfortable question to ask, because if they didn't do what they did, like, we wouldn't be here, presumably, right? Or we'd still all have like British accents, maybe. And we think like, was it? Now, I generally am of the mind that it was right. It was the right thing to do. But just they didn't do it rashly. They didn't do it quickly. They didn't do it casually. How do I know this? Because I can read, right? The Declaration of Independence. If you've never read it, you should read it. You know, it's one of the important documents in our country. And here's part of the Declaration of Independence. This is what the founders said. They said, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be charged or changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So a couple of thoughts there. The founders knew this. Number one, you actually have to be able to give a reason, like reasons, plural, why you think it's a good idea to burn everything down. You can't just do it because you feel like it, right? And then they said also, prudence tells us we shouldn't do this quickly or rashly for light and transient causes. And so they understood, maybe even reflecting on Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and Romans 13, that wisdom actually looks like a few things in weighing where are we actually at in human history. Number one, they understood that we should have the wisdom, the willingness to suffer patiently, waiting until corruption becomes so bad that it is evident of what they say, quote, a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. This is more than government corruption. It's more than personal wickedness on the part of government officials. This is a government that has become unworkable and under which it is impossible to live. And if we were to say, what is, as Solomon's saying, the proper time? That's the best I could do. I can do no better than that. If there is such a proper time, it would be at the point at which the government shows a design to reduce its people to absolute despotism. And I ask you, is that what you are living under today? Right? Now, these people today who, like the militia groups that think that they are defenders of the Constitution and the ones that are advocating for armed military overthrow of the government, I can tell you they don't even understand the documents that they say they are defending. Why? Because if you read the Declaration of Independence and you read the actual reasons that the founders give, they're giving things like the King of England is making slaves of its people. The King of England is holding a standing army in our city in times of peace, and an army that is allowed to rape and murder and steal from people without consequence. Right? Now I ask you, is that what you live under? I don't think anyone lives under that. So the point is, if there is a proper time, this is not it. This is not it. And secondly, Solomon says, not only would the proper time be required, but the just way. There's only one word there in Hebrew. It's the word mishpat, means justice or judgment. That is, the wise heart does not decide to throw off government, one, at the wrong time, but also the wise heart does not throw off government with blind rage, but with justice. And again, looking historically, this is largely the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution, 1776 and forward, and the French Revolution came about 20 or so years later. And the big distinguishing difference is that the American Revolution, of pretty much every revolution in human history, did not seek vengeance. Every revolution that you see in human history leads to a time period of vengeance after a new regime is installed. In France, that was called, historically, now what's called the Reign of Terror, from 1793 to 1794. Sometimes it's just simply called the Terror. And what it was the revolutionaries won, and they installed a new government, and they started executing people en masse by guillotine. And it was turned even against many revolutionaries that were suspected of conspiring against the new regime. And so the situation quickly devolved into absolute chaos and violence and brutality and something very much not justice. And so this is the issue for today. We're looking at government and all this stuff. People today, increasingly in our culture, I only belabor all of this because I see people increasingly wondering out loud if it's time for, say, like civil war or revolution. And church, I don't think it's time for that. I think it's time for prayer. I think it's time for courageous participation in society. Like a lot of what has happened is that Christians just don't participate in the civic sphere. Christians don't take seriously the right and privilege and duty to vote. Christians don't take seriously the right and privilege and duty to participate in like local communities. Like Christians, many don't ever attend, like say a city council meeting. And I'm not saying that you should go to every single one of them, but like so many people today are wondering, like, is it time for armed resistance? And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's time to trust God. It's time to pray. It's time to speak up. Sure, all of those things. But it's not time for guns. It's not time for bullets. It's not time for trying to assassinate political leaders. We still live in a day and a society in which our problems with one another should be handled by debate and dialogue, discussion, not by fists and bullets. And I, by and large, do not trust revolutionaries. I don't. I think revolutionaries are often just simply driven by a mix of rage and self-righteousness. And they turn quickly into blind mobs calling for blood, crowds, mobs of people, the majority of whom don't even know what they're there for. And so a person has to have two things in place in order to stand wisely and righteously against the state: a just cause and a proper time. We saw in COVID as a church a few years ago, there did come a time for some measured and wise and prayerful civic disobedience. We came to time, we didn't do that with like a grin on our face. We didn't do that with a foolish, hoorah kind of attitude. We did that with, we do not like to disobey government. That's not what we are out to do. But we came to a time period where we decided as a church that the Bible clearly commands us to gather, and so we can't do this no gathering thing. We did that for a time while we wrestled with things, wrestled with trying to figure out what was going on, and what exactly was the situation at hand. And we came to the decision as a church that we were going to meet and gather, and if we got in trouble for that, we would just bear the consequences because we thought that's what God is telling us to do. So absolutely there are times, and maybe some more of those times will come. And what it will be time for, the proper time and the just way, is a wise, righteous, humble, civic disobedience, maybe. But by and large, Christians are people who respect government as instituted by God, who trust God to manage his world, and who walk in faith. So we call for more prayer. Do you pray for our government? You should. We should as a church. And yes, that means people who are currently in power, as well as perhaps the people who you hope will be in power. It means right now we should be lifting up government, lifting up politics in prayer. And ultimately, Christians are concerned with politics and government because we are concerned with people. We desire for people to thrive, for communities to thrive, for societies to thrive. We desire justice rather than injustice, and good rather than evil, and truth rather than falsehood, and faith rather than idolatry. We desire for people to live freely so that they may freely choose to trust Jesus without harassment by the state. We desire that people not live under tyranny and oppression. And so we care about politics because we care about all those things. But ultimately still, and I don't mean this to discount everything that we've talked about today, but ultimately, Christians care a lot more about people than we do about governments. And we care a lot more about eternity than we care about this life. And so the great hope of the saints is not in any earthly kingdom. We should engage in the world. That's what Jesus says. We're in the world. And we can't go out of the world. We're in the world, and we should engage and participate. But our ultimate hope is not located there, but is in the kingdom of our great King Jesus. And so the Bible's testimony consistently is that we are ultimately strangers as we walk through this world. We are a people seeking a homeland. We are a people seeking a city that is prepared for us in Christ by his blood. We desire a better country, a heavenly country. So we hope for that, and we participate in our world for the sake of people's souls. Amen? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we confess that we are frustrated and vexed by a great many things that we see going on in our society today. There are many things that are frustrating. Our people are in many ways idolatrous, faithless, corrupt, wicked, evil, and that is present in our ruling class as well. And so we're frustrated by that. We lament and we grieve that. And we also confess, Father, that we have not done everything that we can and should do to address that. We have not spoken when we have had opportunities. We have had fear when we should have courage. We have had apathy when we should have concern. But we thank you and praise you because you are governing every single thing that happens. You are the sovereign God in control, ruling over human history. And so we trust you. And I pray that you would help us have wisdom by your Spirit to know how we should engage with our society with love, compassion, truth, and wisdom. I pray that you'd give us boldness and courage to speak up where we should speak up. Protect us from self-righteous rage and grievance and anger. Protect us from the rash decisions that many people are advocating for today. Help us to hold out the light and hope of Jesus Christ in our city, in our country, in our world. Help us in this. Help us to trust in Jesus and to long for his kingdom. We ask this in his name. Amen. Would you take the next couple of minutes to pray and meditate on what God has said to you today? And then we'll conclude our time with a song of worship and communion.